you very much, Roland. Hello. Ah, that's good. So yeah, a little bit of a change of pace from me today, I think, based on the programme that I saw. So I know a lot of what's been talked about today has been around investing your own money within your pension and perhaps how to draw down your pension in retirement as well. But I'm going to look at the thing that everybody gets, or the vast majority of people anyway, will have some sort of entitlement towards, and the thing that acts as the foundation for most people's retirement income plans, and that is, of course, the state pension. A couple of things to preface this with. The UK state pension system, as we'll see as we go through the presentation, is unfortunately one of, if not the most complicated part of the UK's pension system. And that's clearly not ideal, given that it's the thing that everybody, including the poorest in society, are going to rely on, but that's something that's happened over years and decades of incremental changes, which we'll talk about. The other problem with the state pension system is, as we've seen, particularly in recent weeks and months, it is right at the heart of our political system. So not only do we have a state pension system that is more complicated than certainly I would like it to be, we also have a state pension that is riddled with uncertainty, and certainly anyone who's more than 10 years away from retirement can't be guaranteed either the amount of money they'll get from the state pension or the age that they'll get it. So with that, let's crack on. The usual message from compliance, so what I'm saying is guidance and not advice, and it's possible the tax treatment of pensions will change during this presentation, judging by the government of recent years. So to kick off, start from the beginning, always a good place to start. 1908, a big year for various reasons. A chance for me to use the spinny thing as well. The Model T Ford was first launched in the US by Henry Ford. 1908, you can have any colour you like as long as it's black. We also saw Albert Einstein's theory of relativity beginning to take hold in the scientific community. And the first horror film premiered in Chicago, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I know horror films have become a lot worse since then. And of course, bigger than all of that, well, perhaps not bigger than the theory of relativity, but a state pension was born. So in the UK, legislation was brought forward to bring the first version of a state pension in 1908, with the first payment made in 1909. Now, this is slightly different to the system that we see today. So it was a non-contributory system. And one of the more interesting things I think about the first state pension is the state pension age was higher than it is today, which is quite bonkers when you think about it. You think of the medical advances that have happened since 1908. That's well over 100 years. You think of the way longevity has moved, life expectancy has moved since that date, and the state pension age was, well, just about 4 years older back then than it is today. So only 1 in 4 people survived to receive the state pension, and even those who did were only likely to receive it for 9 years. So very different, a very basic benefit at that starting point in time. You'd get 5 shillings a week if your income was 10 shillings a week, non-contributory, as I said, and even right at the start, we had complexity. So the value was tapered away for those with higher earnings to 0 for people with incomes of £31 or more. And for those who don't recognise this, well, the sinister gentleman on the right here, that is Herbert Asquith, the Prime Minister of the time. Now, I'm going to skip on a little bit because I've only got 20 minutes to 1942, and we're in the middle, of course, of the Second World War. And during that time of unprecedented conflict in the West, William Beveridge was tasked with coming up with some reforms for the welfare state. And now this goes way beyond pensions, of course. We're talking about social security, we're talking about healthcare and all the rest of it. But I thought, given the climate that we experience today and given the politicians we have today, I thought this quote from Beveridge was particularly telling of the politicians we perhaps used to have and the thinkers we used to have. So for those who can't read it, now when the war is abolishing landmarks of every kind is the opportunity for using experience in a clear field. A revolutionary moment in the world's history is a time for revolutions, not for patching. So Beveridge envisaged radical reforms to to slay what he called the 5 giants, those giants of want, ignorance, disease, squalor, and idleness. Now, there was clearly a lot going on at that time, and we saw a change of government and a change of prime minister in the post-war era. So Churchill was out and Clement Attlee came in. So clearly some uncertainty about whether the Beveridge reforms would take place under a new government. In the event they did, the key principles of Beveridge's idea for social reform came to pass. So that meant a new national health service, it meant reforms to social security benefits, and most interestingly for somebody like me, it meant the creation of the first universal contributory state pension system. And that's effectively the system that underpins what we have today. We've seen reforms over the years, and we'll get to that, but the basis of the system we have today was built back in 1948. So you'd get, if you're a single person, you get £1.06 from the state, £2.02 for a married person, so that's about 30 quid or 48 quid in today's money. It was a flat rate payment, so no earnings protection attached. And again, quite interestingly, look at those state pension ages, paid at 65 for a man and 60 for a woman. That has not changed hugely, certainly not up until 2010 in any case. Now, what I call complexification, this is something that we see throughout state pension. And we've got there's this constant battle between trying to have fairness in the state pension system and trying to have a simple state pension system, and the two just don't work together. So throughout time we've seen sways towards fairness and towards extra complexity as well, and then we've seen away from that and back towards something that's simpler, but some people might argue isn't as fair as the old system. So that flat rate pension that we started with in 1948, it just provided a very basic level of retirement income. But post-war we had a very tight labour market, close to full employment, and employers were looking for ways to retain their staff. And one of the ways they did that was offering an earnings-related part of the pension to go alongside that basic entitlement. Now, despite all this happening, in the 1950s, most people still didn't have an entitlement to an earnings-related pension. The government decided that needed to change. So in 1961, I would call this the beginning of the state pension becoming far, far too complicated. The graduated retirement benefit was introduced. So the essential point of this was if you earn more money, you should be able to build up extra entitlements to what were called pension units. And then over time, that was felt that would be a fairer system because those who pay more in would get more out at the end, which has a logic to it. However, the problem with the graduated retirement benefit system was that the government was never willing to accept the cost of offering this in a way that would really be meaningful to people. So there was no earnings linked for those notional pension units that people could build up. And so over a period of 20 years or so, while the notional pension units weren't going up in value, inflation ran on a cumulative basis at about 300%. And as a result, it was deemed to be something of a failure by lots of people. So that's the first version of an additional pension on top of the basic element. We then had two other versions of additional pension that were slightly different added. So the State Earnings Related Pension Scheme, or the catchy title SERPs, in 1978. That was then replaced by the State Second Pension. So George Bush wasn't involved in that, but Tony Blair certainly was. The State Second Pension, slightly different, designed to ensure that those who take on unpaid work were allowed to build up extra state pension entitlements in the same way as those who were employed. But what happened as a result of that attempt at fairness, you ended up with a system where somebody could have three slightly different entitlements to three different types of additional pensions. So you could have the basic state pension, a graduated retirement benefit, SERPs, and S2P all at the same time. So you get into a stage now where people have little to no idea of what they're entitled to. As a foundation for a private savings system, it's not ideal. Adding to that complexity, contracting out, one of my least favourite subjects, but millions of people contracted out of the state pension during that period of time, so the ability to give up your entitlement to the additional state pension and in return benefit from lower NI contributions. So what you've got is lots of people building up loads and loads of different state pension entitlements all over the place. Very few two people would have had the same state pension entitlements at the same time. the government, so the coalition government, so it was obviously pre-2016, the coalition government decided that we needed to simplify the system. So they did away with contracting out and they introduced a new flat rate state pension. So that's been the case just for future retirees. That's been the case since April 2016. So in today's money, the flat rate state pension about £168.60 a week, or just over £8,700 a year. Now, of course, is protected by the triple lock, which we'll come on to, has been heavily politicised, so goes up with the highest of average earnings, average inflation, or 2.5%. A little note there, next year's increase in line with the bumper earnings figure of 3.9%. Even under this simplified system, not everybody gets the same amount. So you've got to have a 35-year national insurance record in order to get the full amount. And you have to have at least 10 years in order to get something, although it would be a reduced level. I'm not quite sure. You've got to go back to go to the future. I think that's what I was doing there. So back to the future. In reality, it's going to take a long, long time for that old system that I talked about at the start, so all those different benefits to be wrung out of the new system. And the reason for that is the government rightly felt that it needed to honour accrued rights, so honour the benefits that people had paid into under the previous system. So it would have been incredibly unfair if you'd built up a state pension entitlement that was a lot higher than the flat rate amount of £168.60 a week in today's terms, and then we're told, actually, you can only get £168.60. That would be unfair. The government recognised that, and so as a result, anybody who's built up entitlements under that old system has them honoured under the new system. Equally, anyone who's contracted out, so anyone who paid lower national insurance contributions in order to not get additional state pension entitlements, they have a deduction applied, what's known as a COD, a contracted out deduction. One important thing to note, and something that I certainly get quite a lot of questions on because I think it causes a bit of confusion, so the state pension triple lock only applies to the flat rate amount of the state pension. So if you built up entitlements under the old system, it would just be the basic state pension. Under the new system, it's the flat rate amount. But if you built up entitlements under SERPs or S2P, so you've got a bigger entitlement than £168.60, then anything above £168.60 only goes up in line with CPI inflation. So it doesn't benefit from the triple lock in the same way as that foundation simple amount does benefit. So I've talked there about the state pension amount and how that state pension system has evolved over decades and decades to become incredibly complicated and unwieldy. But clearly, there's a second part to our state pension system, and that is the age at which you get it. Now, that's something, as I touched on earlier, that hasn't changed for decades and decades and decades up until the beginning of this decade. So some interesting stats here, I think. When the modern state pension was introduced in 1948, think about that, 1948, a 65-year-old could expect to spend 13 and a half years in receipt of it, so roughly a quarter of their life. Fast forward to 2017, that same 65-year-old can expect to live for 22.8 years, so over a third of their adult life. It doesn't take a genius to work out that if you combine the demographic shifts, so more people over the age of 65 and those people living much longer, you add up to a fairly serious cost to the state and potentially a fairly serious cost falling on future taxpayers as well. And so the result of that has been the introduction of the proposal of an accelerated timetable for increasing the state pension age. So as I'm sure most of you know, the state pension age for men and women was equalised at age 65 in 2018, and then is due to rise to 66 by October 2020. Now, I'm not going to go into the fairness of that. Clearly, the issue of WASPI looms large here, but that is the plan under the current government, and indeed, no political party is suggesting that we don't go up to age 66. So that is happening by October 2020. We then have plans put forward under the current government to increase the state pension age to 67 by 2028, and then probably the most controversial part of the plan to accelerate the increase to age 68 from 2046 to 2039. Now, given some of the issues that the government's faced, they're very keen to ensure that they're seen to be treating people fairly and giving people decent notice of the changes that they're making. So any future changes in the state pension age, the government has committed they'll give you at least 10 years notice of what's going to happen. So still not ideal, frankly, for anyone who's planning a long-term retirement strategy. Still not ideal for me. I've not got a clue when I'm going to get my state pension or how much it's going to be. But there you go. Now, the one big bit of uncertainty, of course, covering all this is the election that's coming up in a few days' time. I know everyone's probably really looking forward to that. I can't remember an election where pensions have been more at the heart of the offer that's been made to the electorate. So look at Boris Johnson here on the left. I tried to find an equally unflattering photo of the two of them, but Boris Johnson just has an odder face, doesn't he? But the Conservative Party said that they would maintain the state pension triple lock as that part of their offer to older voters. But interesting that they said nothing on the state pension age. Now, I'm sure all of you have seen that Labour has gone all out for the over 65 vote. So maintaining the state pension triple lock, of course, every party seems to have decided that that needs to remain in place, although none of them seem to be brave enough to articulate exactly why that needs to be the case. Freezing the state pension age at 66, which is a dramatic commitment, given that they haven't put any costs whatsoever on that in their manifesto, and fully compensating the WASPy women. One of the reasons I try to avoid talking about WASPy women is I'm slightly fearful that one day I'll do one of these presentations and there'll be banners everywhere and I'll be being heckled from the back of the room. So to wrap things up then, so the state pension, clearly a key element for everyone's retirement income planning. Once you get there, it's the guaranteed amount, inflation protected, that you will get throughout your retirement. So knowing how the system works, what you're entitled to, and what you're going to build on top of that is pretty crucial for most people. Unfortunately, because it's right in the middle of the political system and because it's incredibly expensive, it is subject to constant change. So knowing exactly what you're going to get, certainly if you're someone in there who's younger than 55 years old, is incredibly difficult. When it comes to the election, don't want to say too much about it, but any promise that any politician is making about anything, you should consider the long-term implications of those promises. So if, for example, a politician is promising to freeze the state pension age at 66 forever, then at some point or another, that's going to cost money. And the question to any politician making that pledge is, where will that money come from? Which generation will that money come from? And where will those tax rises, which will have to happen, be incurred? So on that note, I'll hand you back to Nick. Thank you very much.